antler points and measurement presentation. Game Division Staff Specialist Tony Wasley.
The agenda shows the title of this informational report could be Analysis of Millinery Antler Points and Measurements. And it's kind of further explained as how point class information and antler measurement data can be used to facilitate big game management. And I guess just a little background on the issue. Questions have been asked as to what measures hunters are currently providing the department with respect to successful hunters from their big game species that they're harvesting, what we're doing with that, and should we be asking for more data? How could we use that additional data? What might we ask for? So I guess it's not necessarily an analysis of antler points and measurements, but a little bit of history on what we do and why we do it. So just as a little background information, we request all of our ungulate hunters to report some aspect of antler or horn characteristics from the animals that they're harvesting. And what we do is we take that data and it supplements our knowledge and our understanding of herd dynamics and age structure. And depending on the species, can we shut these lights off up here, or does that help a little bit? There we go.
Perfect.
Depending on the species, we ask for different things and use it in somewhat different ways. So as we look at the different species, pronghorn antelope, for example, it's relatively new practice, but we've been requesting that successful hunters measure horn length and report that online with their questionnaire information that also includes how many days they hunted, unit of kill, all that information. And so when we look at a pronghorn, if we're looking at a buck hunter for a pronghorn antelope and we're asking them to measure the horn and provide that to us, we can look at two extremes in pronghorn. And for example, if we look at one individual unit and we look at the lengths, the horn lengths for that unit, if we saw that the vast majority of horns in that unit were 14 to 17 inches, and then we'd know that we weren't harvesting presumably any of the yearlings in that population. And conversely, if we had a bunch of 10, 11, 12-inch bucks coming out of there, then we would know that we were dipping into that yearling class. So, of course, when we go out and survey pronghorn, we're classifying bucks, and we're classifying adult bucks and yearling bucks. So we have that information from our survey. That information goes into a population model. And we've talked about all these systems of checks and balances, and just one additional aspect of that system of checks and balances is for hunters to report to us some characteristic of the horn or antler of the species that they harvest. So that's what we get from pronghorn and how we apply it. For bighorn sheep, historically we had a minimum score requirement. It was a 144-inch 3/4 curl requirement. We started scoring all the sheep that came in. We went away from that, went to an any ram scenario. We still provide an unofficial score that allows us to handle those animals, that allows us to capture an accurate age from those horns, and interact with the hunter to glean some of their insights from their experience. But that information also helps the biologist in verifying that we are successful with our management objectives in trying to maintain a relatively stable average age of harvest and a high average age, so that we know that age, for example, isn't limiting the size of their horns. Mountain goats, we collect length and age data similar to bighorn sheep. We use that because mountain goats are either sex tags because of the difficulty in differentiating mamies from billies. we capture the length, we get gender, and we look at the age. Again, it's a lot more difficult in managing goat populations. We want to make sure that we don't dip into the nannies. We want to make sure that we don't see a decreasing age through time, which might tell us we're over-harvesting, so we monitor that age and length. Now with our branch antlered animals like elk and mule deer, it's a little bit different. For elk, we request that hunters provide number of points. And we use that point class information in a couple different ways. Of course, it goes into our harvest data so we can subtract those from our population estimates in our models. A couple years ago, Mike Cox had a project where he was requesting that hunters provide front teeth from harvested elk along with some antler morphometrics. I think it was the circumference between fourth and fifth, and beam length and width. From those measurements, he could use those measurements to estimate what the Boone and Crockett score was, and then took the teeth and did cementum annuli analysis, sent them into a laboratory, and they looked at the layers of cementum on the teeth and could determine the age and then look at the score as a function of age. We kind of use that to look at how old our elk needed to be in order to develop the sorts of trophy potential that some runners had indicated they desired in those elk. So we kind of use that point class as a proxy of age, but we combine it with some other information as well. Deer, we get point class information from deer as well, and it's typically I think the maximum number of points on either antler, and then again that goes into our model. If we know that we have a population that has, for example, 200 4 points, then through known ages of 4 points, a certain percentage of those, a small percent may be 2-year-olds, a larger percent may be 3-year-olds. We'll spread the removal of those 4 points proportionate across the population. Also, two other things that we do with the point class data from mule deer harvest is basically boiled down to two basic statistics. One is the percentage of the harvest that is 4-point or better, and although it's somewhat arbitrary, it's probably pretty widely accepted. That a lot of hunters set the standard for their harvest as a 4-point or better. So we can basically look at the percent of the harvest, the total harvest that's comprised of 4-point or better bucks, and we can use that as kind of a measure of success combined with hunter success. And between hunter success and percent 4-point or better in the harvest, that gives us kind of a crude measure of quality, realizing it's arbitrary and it isn't necessarily a biological quality, but it's what hunters have expressed as a desire. Those are long-standing statistics and measures that are used widely, not only throughout the West and with mule deer, but also in whitetail and other populations. There's a kind of an interesting relationship that exists between hunter success and percent 4-point or better. They're often inversely related. As one goes up, the other goes down. And that's typically years following good fawn recruitment, hunter success increases, and it's increasing because there's a lot of young bucks in the population available for harvest. But since the cause of that increased hunter success is increased recruitment, meaning those yearling bucks, then typically the percent of 4-point or better in the harvest decreases. And similarly, in years following poor recruitment, there's a shortage of yearling bucks in the population available for harvest, and so hunter success may go down in a unit or statewide, but we usually see an increase in percent 4-point or better because a larger percentage of the harvested animals are mature animals due to the absence of recruited yearlings. So again, kind of a question driving driving this is, should we be collecting more data or different data on buck antlers, width, height, mass, and we can look at some of these other metrics. The question is, how could we incorporate them into our management schemes? We have to go back and look at, why we would be collecting that data. And really, the reason why we're collecting the data that we collect is it's mainly to verify age class representation. Any population that we have where we see the majority of that harvest in those young age classes and an absence of branch antlered deer where it's mainly just maybe spikes or 2 points, we see all those yearlings, and we see an absence of 4 point or better, then that suggests that perhaps harvest is limiting that population's ability to produce mature animals available for harvest. And similarly, if you had a really high percentage of 4 point or better in your harvest, but you have sportsmen that have an expressed desire to hunt that have stated that they just want to provide a healthy protein source and fill their freezer, then there's a happy medium and there's a balance there. So we like to see good representation of all age classes to meet some of those diverse demands. But it's important to recognize that antler points are a very crude and inaccurate index of age. Age is only one of 3 factors affecting antler measurements, the other 2, of course, being genetics and nutrition. So we can't place too much emphasis on points as far as representative age. We can look at a year like this year where things were extremely dry, and where we see the manifestation of that in antler development is most apparent is in young yearlings, actually. And that's been documented in Arizona and New Mexico as well, and it's been really evident in some of our postseason surveys where we're seeing a really high percentage of spike yearlings as opposed to 2 point yearlings. When we have good forage conditions out there, the forage quality results in a much higher percentage of those yearlings being 2 points than spikes. When it's dry like it is this year, we see a lot more spikes than 2 points. And so even though it's really evident that those young age classes, those same sorts of nutritional constraints affect the older age classes. So it varies widely from year to year, and unit to unit for that matter. So numerous studies have documented mule deer antler development is greatest. They reach their greatest potential at 5.5 to 6.5 years old. Most of the literature says that antler length, potential for maximum length occurs at 5.5 and mass at 6.5. We look at pronghorn, 2 to 3 years of age is where pronghorn reach their greatest potential. Length at 2, mass at 3. Elk, we're talking about 9 plus. And these animals, at least the branch antlered cervids, mule deer, and elk, will regress after these ages, all other things being equal. Meaning if you have the same forage, the same energy expenditure, at 5.5, 6.5, you would typically expect those antlers to be smaller at 7.5, 8.5. So since our desire is to verify the presence of these age classes, again, we need to say that antler points are a very crude and inaccurate index of age. So we try to make sure that there's good representation of the point classes in the harvest, and then proportionate to those age classes, those animals are removed by age from the model, from the population model. For example, two extreme scenarios: if we had one population where 50% of the harvest was spike or 2 points and 25% was 4 point or better, we would take a much larger portion of the yearlings, 50% of that harvest, an actual known number of animals would come out of the yearling class in the model, and that might be subsequent years, that might be poorly represented in that model. So you would see that hit that population took, the deficit in those older age animals when they're 3 or 4 years older. And Again, conversely, if you had 75% of your harvest at 4-point or better, then 4 or 5 years down the road, all of the yearlings that existed at that time would move into that age class. Just those older age animals would be removed. There are better measures of age for mule deer, and I guess if, from a management perspective, if we have concerns of overharvest, we should probably be using teeth. We do this in a limited amount now. We will send teeth in from animals where we have questions about their age. We check ourselves with our ability to age our bighorn sheep. Since we're using rings on the horns, we want to make sure that we're doing it consistently and accurately around the state. So we send those teeth in to check ourselves. We'll see animals that have excessive tooth wear, and there may be some question as to how old that animal is, and we can send those in. We maintain a contract with a lab in Montana, typically about $5 a tooth to get those ages, and so that helps us understand what a maximum age that some of these animals may reach, and we can constantly refine and improve our modeling as a result of adding that knowledge. So back to the original question, should we be asking more from our hunters? Should we be asking them to report more to us? Should we be asking for more specifically antler width data? I guess I would say that the antler width data would provide no apparent benefit to Nevada's mule deer management as it currently exists. I don't know how we could use that to better understand harvest or better manage those populations, especially given that antler size is heavily confounded by things for which there are far better direct measures, age and nutrition. We know that we can collect teeth and we can get a better direct measure of age rather than going to the literature and looking at the percentage of 4 points that might be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old in nutrition, where we know that we can measure subcutaneous fat or visceral fat or some measure of body condition rather than look at that antler and try to determine if it's a genetically inferior animal or one that's underfed or it's just a more direct measure. Additionally, I think there's potentially negative consequences to requesting hunters measure antler width. And by requesting that they measure that width, I think we're doing two things. One, I think we're placing greater emphasis of the hunt on the animal's antlers rather than the experience and potentially perpetuating a trophy idea. So not that one is right, one is wrong, or one is better than the other, but for a 16-year-old kid that's tickled pink with a 4-point to ask him to take a tape measure and now drag that tape across and report to us how wide it is, and he knows his uncle shot a 28-incher and he's got to now write 17 inches down, that could potentially take away from his experience and place a greater emphasis on the antlers rather than the experience. Additionally, I think it potentially subjects all hunters to an ideal ascribed to by a subset of hunters, and that, again, kind of speaks to the trophy notion. If point class data were inadequate, or if antler width had more direct relevance to mule deer management, perhaps we could justify it, but given the limited application of antler width data, the existence of more appropriate age measures, and confounding effects of age genetics and nutrition on antler development, I think the potentially negative social consequences don't necessarily warrant implementing antler width reporting requirements for Nevada's hunters. But I'd be more than happy to entertain any questions about our reporting requirements or how we use the data for mule deer or any of the other species I mentioned.
Commissioner McBeth.
Should we, from time to time, be collecting teeth on mule deer, or ask our hunters to collect teeth on mule deer?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I wanted to do some of that this year, but I'll be honest with you. This year we sent out several thousand envelopes requesting samples from deer hunters in various parts of the state. We're requesting CWD samples. We're requesting skin samples to do some pathogen testing, specifically BVB, looking for the potential for persistently infected animals. We're collecting tissue samples to cooperate with the geneticist at UNR, who has a heritage project with us, looking at genetic variability around mountain ranges. And since all these programs are dependent on this voluntary compliance, I'm reluctant to ask for too much in any one year because I really don't want to place too much of a burden on our sportsmen that are really a key cooperator in all this. So a couple of things that I would like to do in the future, I would like to not only collect teeth, but from the animals that we collect teeth, I'd also like to have a height and width measurement on their antlers and begin to create a portrait of the variation not only within a year, but between years on how age and antler growth and potentially forage conditions, or at least climate, affect antlers. And one of the ways that we've been increasing our sample size this year is working with a subset of taxidermists around the state. And I believe there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 taxidermists that we selected this year, asked input from our biologists who have working relationships with these guys to recommend some taxidermists in their areas, and we're trying to get 15 to 20 tissue samples from each of these taxidermists around the state to begin to kind of look at DNA profiles. So I think it's something we should definitely do. We've talked about it quite a bit. I don't think it's cost prohibitive at $5 a tooth, and I think it would yield some really interesting results. So I would like to and plan to at some point in the future.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else have any questions? Mr. Raines.
Question, you mentioned about 3 factors affecting antler growth and genetics, nutrition, and age. What about stress? I've heard a lot about different stressors causing wide variations in antler growth. That's something I remember seeing that in Wasley publications and then some other stuff too, talking about stress and the various, whether it's hunting stress, disturbance from various sources, human or other animals, or predation stress. Lots of different stressors can cause that by basically removing them from the habitat they're normally occupied. Right?
I guess there's perhaps 2 ways that I can think of, and maybe let's say injury, for example. If there is injury, any kind of body injury at the time that antlers are being developed, there's what they call it contralateral, or opposite side manifestation in the antler. So if there's a limb injury on the right side of the body, typically the left antler has some kind of deformity, but it depends on when that injury occurs. So that could be one mechanism where stress has affected antler development. I think the other types of stress that you mentioned, disturbance or predation, I think all of those could be couched under the general category of nutrition, because what we're talking about is the nutritional plane, where that animal is, and if that animal is running more to avoid predators, or if it's feeding less to avoid human disturbance, then all those things will affect where that animal is on the nutritional plane. There's also, with animalogenesis, it's a hormonally regulated activity, and there are stress hormones that are amplified. A small amount of hormone can have a large effect on the animal in terms of behavior and those stresses. But a lot of those stresses, I think it would be difficult, if not impossible, to tease apart the effect of the hormone, stress level hormone, versus changes in energy budgets or foraging activity. But I think you could probably look at 2 animals in similar areas and maybe tease apart some of those stressors or effects of stress. But I think the age variation, genetic variation, probably confound it.
I'd say that, earlier you mentioned there about antler points being a very crude molecular index has got to be completely right. I mean, I've seen that every year. I probably see as many deer as most biologists do. I mean, looking at it, big dew points. Yeah, what do you report that as? That's a yearling, right, on paperwork.
Well, when we do our surveys, and
That's all it shows in the paperwork, in the hunting return cards.
on one return card.
Yeah.
But what I like to say is that as I indicated, is that the hunter return is just one part of the picture. We have our surveys, and when we survey our populations, when we see 2 points, we make the distinction between a mature 2 point versus a yearling 2 point. So when we see those 2 points in the harvest, it may take, they're going to be a very small percentage of that harvest, and it doesn't make that distinction in the questionnaire, mature 2 point, yearling 2 point. So it would likely come out of the yearling age class.
And 4 points that are yearling, and it's interesting this year, just all what you said there, I saw a couple people out hunting very close areas, yearling 4 points and giant 2 points. Well, how does that deal with it? Now you're talking about a few canyons. Right. There's definitely, maybe it's genetics, maybe it's different stressors, maybe one is from a different mountain range and he showed up that week, I don't know. But yeah, it makes it obvious that it's very crude.
Yeah, and that's why we go to the literature and our past experiences through check stations in Nevada, and we look at the percentage of 4 points that are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, and try to take those animals proportionately from those age classes. We don't assume that they represent one age class, but it can vary in wet years versus dry years. Like I was talking about some of the differences between spikes and 2 points. Some of those same differences exist between 3 points and 4 points.
Anybody else? All right. Thank you, Tony.
Yep.
Move on to agenda item number C,